The hook. The child's words hung in the frigid air like a curse-given voice. Daudavist eki, broderin min. Don't eat, my brother. Eric's axe slipped from numb fingers, clattering against the stone floor of the great hall. 20 winters had passed since he'd last heard that phrase, spoken in his dying sister's voice as fever consumed her small body. But this waif before them couldn't be more than 8 summers old, her pale hair matted against a skull that seemed too large for her skeletal frame. What did you say? Eric's voice came out as barely a whisper, but it cut through his men's hungry growling like a blade through flesh. The girl's hollow eyes fixed on his, and for a heartbeat, Eric saw something that made his warrior's soul recoil. Ancient knowledge lived in those depths, the kind of knowing that came only from witnessing horrors beyond mortal comprehension. Bjorn, step away from that bread. The command cracked like a whip, freezing his second-in-command mid-reach. The burly Norseman's face twisted with confusion and barely controlled hunger. Eric, the men haven't eaten in 3 days. Look at this feast. I said, step away. Around the hall, his crew of 30 warriors stood like statues caught between obedience and starvation. Their faces were gaunt, beards matted with sea spray and desperation. They'd followed Eric through countless raids, trusted his instincts when younger captains would have led them to ruin. But hunger was a demon that whispered louder than loyalty. The girl took a trembling step forward, her bare feet making no sound against the cold stone. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. The dead feast eternal here, Ironbeard. But the living who share their table never see another sunrise. How did she know his name? Eric's reputation stretched across the northern seas, but this child looked as though she'd never ventured beyond these mist-shrouded walls. Who are you? He knelt slowly, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he could see that her skin held an unnatural pallor, like moonlight on fresh snow. How do you know the old words? The girl's lips curved in a smile that belonged on no child's face. I know because I listen. I know because I remember. And I know because she told me you would come. Eric's blood stilled. She. But before the child could answer, young Olaf, barely 17 and foolish with youth, lunged past Bjorn toward the nearest platter. His fingers closed around a honey-glazed loaf, and he bit deep before anyone could stop him. The transformation was instantaneous. Olaf's eyes rolled back, showing only white, while his body went rigid as ship's timber. A sound escaped his throat, not quite scream, not quite song, that made every man in the hall grab for their weapons. The bread fell from his lips, but something dark and viscous dripped from his mouth instead of crumbs. The girl whispered, her ancient composure cracking. Another one lost. Olaf collapsed, his body convulsing against the floor. Where the honey had touched his skin, pale marks spread like frost across a window. His breathing grew shallow, then stopped entirely. But his eyes remained open and aware, tracking movements with a terrible, hungry intelligence. What have you done to him? Bjorn roared, raising his battle-axe toward the child. Peace, Eric commanded, though his own hand found his sword hilt. She tried to warn us. The girl nodded gravely. The drug feast here nightly, warrior. They prepare these tables for the living, hoping to add fresh souls to their eternal hunger. Your young friend... She glanced at Olaf's still form. He belongs to them now. As if summoned by her words, shapes began materializing from the hall's deep shadows. Translucent figures in rotted burial clothes drifted between the support beams like morning mist given malevolent purpose. Their faces held the slack-jawed emptiness of death, but their eyes burned with an intelligence that spoke of endless, unsatisfied need. Weapons! Eric bellowed, drawing steel as his men formed a defensive circle. But even as his blade sang free of its sheath, he knew iron would do little against these phantoms. The girl stepped closer, her small hand surprisingly warm when she touched his arm. There is another way, Ironbeard, but the price is steeper than blood. Name it. You must descend to where she waits. Face what you've carried all these years. The child's voice dropped to barely audible. Your sister calls for you, Eric Magnusson. She has been calling since the night she died in your arms." The advancing Draug paused at the threshold of the torchlight, as if some invisible barrier held them at bay. But Eric could see that barrier weakening, reality growing thin as gauze. His men looked to him with desperate eyes, hands white-knuckled on useless weapons. Somewhere in the shadows, Olaf's body began to stir with unnatural animation. The child smiled sadly. "Choose quickly, brother. Dawn is still hours away, and the dead grow hungrier with each passing moment." Eric's world tilted as memories crashed through his defenses like a storm-driven longship through harbor chains. The child's words, "Your sister calls for you," unlocked chambers in his mind he'd sealed with 20 years of blood and mead. "Astrid," he whispered, and the name felt like glass in his throat. Behind him, his men shifted restlessly. These were warriors who'd followed him across the Whale Road for 15 seasons, who'd sung his deeds in ale halls from Hedeby to the Orkney Isles. Bjorn Ironside, no blood relation to the legendary king but twice as stubborn, had saved Eric's life in the siege of Londonwick. Gunnar the Stout had pulled him from the surf when Saxon arrows found their mark off the Northumbrian coast. Young Thorvald still bore the scar where he'd taken a blade meant for Eric's back. They were more than crew. They were the family he'd built from the ashes of the one he'd lost, and now they looked at him with eyes that held a faith he wasn't certain he deserved. "Captain?" Bjorn's voice carried the weight of their shared history. "Your orders?" The advancing Draug swayed like kelp in deep currents, their burial shrouds rustling with sounds that might have been wind through dead leaves, or whispers of the damned. But Eric found his attention fixed on the pale child before him, this impossible vessel of ancient knowledge who spoke his dead sister's words. In her hollow features, he glimpsed echoes of the life he'd known before the raiders came to Grimsby, before the screams and the flames and the sight of his father's blood soaking into the timber of their burning hall. Before 8-year-old Astrid had died in his arms, fever-mad and babbling in a tongue no living soul should know. "She suffered," the child continued, her voice carrying across the decades. "But suffering sometimes births purpose. Your sister learned this truth in her final moments, when the boundary between worlds grew thin." Eric's hand tightened on his sword hilt. For 20 years, he'd built his reputation blade by blade, raid by raid. Eric Ironbeard, they called him now, scourge of the Saxon shores, the wolf who ran with 30 loyal hounds. Lords paid tribute rather than face his wrath. Skalds sang of his deeds in the great halls of kings. But beneath the legend lived a truth he'd never spoken aloud. Every village he'd burned, every monastery he'd sacked, every Saxon lord he'd sent to face their nailed god, all of it had been an attempt to outrun the image of Astrid's final moments, the way her small fingers had clutched his tunic, the fever-bright gleam in her eyes as she'd spoken words in a language that predated the Christ followers and their Roman saints. "She told you this would happen," he said, not really asking. The child nodded. "She saw your path, warrior, saw the rage that would drive you across the seas, the guilt that would follow like a hound at your heels. She knew you would build a new family from broken men and lost souls." Around him, those broken men waited. Ragnar One Eye, who'd lost his family to a blood feud and found purpose in Eric's service. Einar the Silent, whose tongue had been cut out by Christ monks, but whose axe spoke eloquently enough. Even young Olaf, now lying still as ship's timber, his soul trapped between worlds, had come to them as an orphan seeking belonging. They'd found brotherhood in the brotherhood of violence, purpose in the pursuit of silver and glory. Under Eric's leadership, they'd carved out a legend that would outlive them all. But legends, Eric was beginning to understand, were just another kind of trap. "What does she want from me?" he asked. The child's expression grew impossibly sad. "What she has always wanted, brother. For you to come home. Home." The word hit like a blade between the ribs. Eric had burned his home, had watched it fall to ash and ember, had buried his sister in earth that still smoked from Saxon torches. There was no home to return to, only this endless cycle of raid and revenge, of building new bonds to replace the ones torn away. But as the Draug pressed closer, and the barrier between worlds wore thin as parchment, Eric began to see the trap he'd built for himself. Every man who followed him became another chain binding him to this existence. Every victory another weight, dragging him deeper into a life built on the foundation of a single, terrible loss. The child stepped closer, her ancient eyes reflecting depths Eric had spent 2 decades refusing to plumb. "Your sister waits below, warrior, in the place between breathing and death, where souls decide their final destination." Behind him, Bjorn cleared his throat. A sound Eric knew meant his second-in-command was preparing to speak hard truths. But for the first time in 20 years, Eric found himself wondering if the hardest truth might be the one he'd been running from all along. The words formed in Bjorn's throat like stones grinding against ship timber. "Eric." His voice carried the weight of 15 winters spent watching his captain's back, of countless battles where they'd stood shield to shield against impossible odds. "Whatever Phantom's trick this is, we deal with it as we always have, together." But even as Bjorn spoke, the great hall around them began to change. The shadows deepened beyond natural darkness, pooling in corners where torchlight should have reached. The very air grew thick, pressing against their lungs like water. And from somewhere far below, deeper than any foundation stone should reach, came the sound of singing. Not the battle songs Eric knew, not the death chants that accompanied warriors to Valhalla's golden roof. This was older, sadder, a melody that spoke of choices made in darkness and prices paid in blood. The voice that carried it was achingly familiar. "Astrid," Eric breathed, and the name seemed to tear something loose inside his chest. The pale child tilted her head, listening to harmonies only she could fully hear. She grows stronger as midnight approaches. The veil between worlds grows thin in places like this, where great grief has soaked into stone and timber. Around them, Eric's men shifted like wolves scenting danger they couldn't see. These were warriors who'd faced Saxon shield walls and Frankish cavalry, who'd weathered North Sea storms that sent other ships to cold graves. But this enemy that lived in shadows and spoke in whispers, threatened them in ways their battle-tested courage couldn't answer. Young Thorvald, barely 20 but already bearing scars from a dozen raids, stepped forward with his hand white-knuckled on his axe haft. "Captain, give us an enemy we can kill. Point us towards something that bleeds." The desperation in the boy's voice cut deeper than any blade. Eric had gathered these men from the wreckage of their former lives, some fleeing blood feuds, others seeking purpose beyond the boundaries of jarls who saw them as expendable. He'd promised them glory, brotherhood, a chance to write their names in saga song. Instead, he'd led them into a trap baited with their own hunger. The Draug pressed closer, their burial shrouds rustling with sounds like winter wind through dead branches. Where they moved, frost began forming on the stone walls, spreading in patterns that hurt to look upon directly. And still that singing continued from below, a voice Eric had thought silenced forever, calling his name with love and infinite patience. "The choice was always going to be yours," the child said softly. "Your sister knew this moment would come. She's been preparing for it, learning the old magics that govern the boundaries between life and death. But the passage she's opened," the girl's ancient eyes grew troubled, "it can only be walked by one who carries the weight of true guilt, one who understands the price of protection." Bjorn's battle-axe sang as he shifted it in his grip. "Eric, whatever debt you think you owe—" "No." The word came out harder than Eric intended, cutting through his second's protest like a blade through sailcloth. "This isn't about debt, old friend. It's about truth." And there it was, the admission he'd carried for 20 years like a stone in his chest. The truth that had driven him across storm-tossed seas and into countless battles, that had made him gather broken, men around him like shields against his own memories. He hadn't failed to save Astrid. He'd chosen not to. The fever had taken her slowly, burning through her small body like fire through dry timber. But in those final hours, as she'd babbled words in tongues that predated Christ and Thor alike, Eric had seen something in her eyes that terrified him more than any Saxon blade. Knowledge that no child should possess. Awareness of things that moved in the spaces between heartbeats. in the pause between lightning and thunder. When the wandering Volva had appeared at their door, an ancient crone with bone-white hair and eyes like winter starlight, she'd spoken of choices, of ways to bind a soul to the world of the living, to stretch the thread of life beyond its natural span. The price would be steep, she'd warned. The child would live, but changed, guardian and prisoner both, walking the knife's edge between worlds until the debt was paid. Eric had held his dying sister close and chosen silence. Now, as the Draug circled like wolves around wounded prey, and his men looked to him for salvation he couldn't provide, Eric finally understood the trap Astrid had laid for him. Not revenge, love. Patient, terrible, absolute love that had waited 20 years for him to find his way home. The singing from below grew stronger, and with it came the scent of familiar things, the herbs their mother had hung from their hall's rafters, the smoke from their father's forge, the salt wind that had blown across the fjords of his childhood, all of it calling him toward a descent he'd spent half his life avoiding. The pale child extended one impossibly small hand. "She's waiting, brother. But the path downward can only be walked alone." Eric stared at the child's outstretched hand as if it were a blade offered hilt first. Behind him, 30 men who'd followed him through hell and high water waited for the command that would either save them or damn them all. The weight of their trust pressed against his shoulders like a burial shroud, alone. The word tasted of ashes in his mouth. Bjorn stepped forward, his scarred face grim in the torchlight. "In 20 years, you've never asked us to stand aside. Not when the Saxon longships outnumbered us 3-1 off Lindisfarne. Not when that Frankish lord's cavalry had us trapped in the marsh country. Why start now? Because this isn't about courage," Eric wanted to say. "Because some battles can't be won with steel and fury. Because the enemy waiting below knows me better than I know myself." Instead, he found himself studying his men's faces, really looking at them, perhaps for the first time in years. These weren't the fresh-faced boys who'd first sworn their oaths to him. Gunnar's beard had gone grey at the temples. Einar's remaining eye held depths that spoke of too many friends buried, too many battles survived through luck as much as skill. Even young Thorvald carried himself with the careful economy of a man who'd learned that every movement might be his last. They'd aged in his service, trading their youth for silver and saga songs. Following him because he'd promised them purpose, a brotherhood forged in battle fire. But what had he really given them? What kind of leader builds his legend on running from ghosts? The singing from below grew stronger, threading through the stone foundations like water finding cracks. Astrid's voice, impossibly preserved, carrying melodies their mother had hummed while working her loom. The sound made Eric's chest tight with a longing he'd thought buried beneath 2 decades of deliberate violence. "Captain," Ragnar One Eye spoke quietly, his remaining eye fixed on the advancing Draug. "Whatever waits down there, we've faced worse together. Remember the monastery at Rivolks? 40 Christ warriors and us with nothing but broken shields and half our oars snapped." Eric remembered. He remembered Ragnar taking a Saxon spear through the shoulder rather than let it find Eric's back. Remembered Gunnar hauling them both out of the burning scriptorium while monks screamed prayers in their foreign tongue. Good men, loyal men, who'd bled for him without question. And he was about to abandon them to face creatures of shadow and bone, while he descended into whatever hell his sister had carved out beneath this cursed place. "The Draug feed on the living," the pale child said, her ancient voice cutting through his thoughts. "Your men's courage won't protect them from hunger that has festered for centuries. Only blood can satisfy blood, and only the guilty can pay what the dead demand." The guilty. Eric's hand found the Thor's hammer at his throat, the same pendant Astrid had worn that he'd pulled from her cooling fingers before they'd burned her body. For 20 years he'd told himself he was honoring her memory with every raid, every Saxon lord sent screaming to their nailed god. But honor was just another word for the lies men told themselves when the truth cut too deep. The truth was simpler and more damning. He'd let her die because he'd been afraid of what she was becoming. Afraid of the knowledge burning behind her fever-bright eyes, the words in dead languages that spilled from her lips like prophecy. The vulva had offered salvation, and Eric had chosen to let nature take its course rather than bind his sister to something beyond his understanding. Cowardice dressed up as mercy. Fear masquerading as wisdom. "How long?" he asked the child. "Until dawn. The barrier between worlds weakens with the dying of the light, but it cannot hold past sunrise. If you haven't reached her by then." She gestured toward the circling drag, their burial shrouds rustling with anticipation. 6 hours, maybe less. Time enough for a man to descend into whatever lay beneath this place of bones and shadows. Time enough to face a sister who'd learned truths that living souls weren't meant to know. Time enough to either break the curse or become part of it. Behind him, Bjorn's breathing had gone shallow and controlled, the way it always did before a desperate charge. His second in command was preparing to follow him into the dark, orders or no orders, just as he'd always done, just as they all would, because that was the brotherhood Eric had built with them. Loyalty unto death and beyond, the very loyalty that made leaving them behind feel like tearing out his own heart. "Swear to me," Eric said without turning around. "Swear that if I don't return by dawn, you'll take the ship and sail for the Orkneys. Don't try to follow, don't wait for a sign, just go." Silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Finally, Bjorn's voice, rough with emotion. "I swear, brother, but only if you swear to come back." Eric looked down at the child's waiting hand, pale as winter moonlight. Some promises he knew were meant to be broken. Eric reached out and grasped the child's hand. The moment their skin touched, the world changed. The great hall, with its scattered bones and guttering torches, with his 30 loyal warriors standing ready to follow him into damnation itself, fell away like a discarded shroud. The child's fingers felt impossibly cold, as if he'd grasped winter moonlight itself, and through that touch flowed sensations that had no names in any living tongue. He was falling, but not through air. Through layers of memory and shadow, through the accumulated weight of 20 years' worth of nights when he'd jerked awake speaking Astrid's name to the darkness. The child, or whatever ancient thing wore her form, guided his descent with the sureness of one who'd walked these paths since the world was young. Above him, he could hear Bjorn's voice calling his name, but it sounded distant as the cry of gulls over a storm-tossed sea. His men's shouts of alarm and the supernatural shriek of the draug faded to whispers, then to nothing at all. There was only the singing now, Astrid's voice rising from depths that had nothing to do with stone and earth, everything to do with the spaces between heartbeats where souls made their choices. "Brother," her voice carried to him without words, a language of memory and blood that predated speech itself. "You came." The descent ended in a chamber that couldn't exist, not in any hall built by mortal hands. The walls curved away into darkness that had weight and presence, shot through with veins of light that pulsed like a great heart. And there, in the center of it all, sat his sister. But not as she'd been in life. Not the fever-bright child who died in his arms 20 years past. This was Astrid as she might have become. A woman grown, beautiful and terrible, with their mother's dark hair and eyes that held the depth of standing stones. She wore robes that seemed woven from starlight and shadow, and when she smiled, Eric felt his heart break and mend and break again. "Hello, Eric." Her voice was exactly as he remembered, but layered now with harmonics that spoke of power earned through suffering. "I've been waiting so long for you to find the courage to come home." He wanted to run to her, to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness for the choice he'd made in her final hours. But something in her expression, patient, knowing, infinitely sad, kept him rooted where he stood. This wasn't the reunion he'd dreamed of in his darkest moments. This was judgment. "The vulva," he said finally. "I should have listened, should have paid whatever price she asked, and bound me to a half-life of service to powers you didn't understand." Astrid tilted her head, and the gesture was achingly familiar, the same curious angle she'd used as a child when puzzling over their father's riddles. "No, brother, you chose mercy even if you didn't recognize it as such." "Mercy?" The word came out as a snarl. You died. I watched you burn on the pyre and carried the guilt for 20 years. If that's mercy, then you understand nothing of what I've become." She rose from her impossible throne, and as she moved, the chamber around them shifted. The walls became transparent, revealing vistas that stretched beyond the boundaries of the living world. The Volva's bargain would have made me her creature, bound to hunt and kill at the bidding of whatever dark thing spoke through her bones. Instead, I chose my own path. Eric felt the ground beneath his feet shift, not physically, but in ways that cut deeper than the merely real. Chose? In my final moments, when the fever burned away everything but truth, I saw the patterns that govern life and death, saw the threads that connect all souls, the prices that must be paid to keep the balance. Her eyes, so familiar, yet ancient beyond measure, fixed on his with terrible compassion. I saw what you would become if I simply died and left you with nothing but guilt. The raider, the wolf of the whale road, the man who'd built a legend on the foundation of a single terrible loss. So you made yourself into this. He gestured at the impossible chamber, at her transformed state. Guardian of the dead, keeper of curses. You trapped yourself between worlds. I saved myself, Astrid corrected gently. And I've been saving others ever since. Every soul that finds its way to this place, lost, hungry, desperate, I give them the choice I never had in life. To rage against the dying of the light, or to find peace in letting go. The weight of understanding settled on Eric's shoulders like chainmail, forged from 20 years of accumulated guilt. The draug above, the cursed bread. This whole place, it's a test. For those wise enough to heed the warnings, yes. For those who listen to the voices that cry out in love rather than hunger. She moved closer, and he caught the scent of summer meadows, of their mother's herb garden in the brief northern blooming. But some souls require stronger measures. Through the transparent walls, Eric could see them, his men, fighting desperately against creatures of bone and shadow. Bjorn's axe sang through the air, cleaving burial shrouds that reformed like smoke. Gunnar roared challenges in the old tongue while something with too many teeth circled just beyond his blade's reach. They fought with the courage he'd taught them, the brotherhood he'd forged from their shared losses, and they were losing. "Let me go back," Eric said, his hand moving instinctively toward a sword that was no longer there. "Whatever you want from me, take it. But let them live." Astrid's smile was infinite and heartbreaking. "Oh, my dear brother, don't you understand yet? I'm not the one keeping you here." Eric's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "What do you mean? The guilt you carry isn't just memory, brother. It's become part of you, a chain forged from 20 years of self-recrimination, growing stronger with every raid, every battle, every night you've cried my name to the darkness." Astrid's form shimmered, and for a moment she appeared as she had in life, small, fevered, dying. "You've made yourself my prisoner." The chamber around them pulsed like a living heart, and Eric felt the truth of her words settle into his bones. Above, his men's battle cries grew more desperate, but here in this place between worlds, their voices seemed to echo from across vast distances. Time moved differently in the realm of the dead. Then how— "Tests!" said a new voice, rough as grinding stone. From the shadows emerged a figure that made Eric's warrior instincts scream danger, tall as a standing stone, wrapped in a cloak that seemed woven from winter itself. Bone-white beard flowed past a belt hung with raven skulls, and eyes like chips of glacier ice fixed on Eric with ancient malevolence. 3 tests, as the old laws demand. Fail, and your men die with the dawn. Your sister remains bound to this threshold, and your own soul joins the Draug eternal. And if I succeed— Eric's hand found empty air where his sword should rest. The figure's smile revealed teeth filed to points. "Why, then you face a choice that will make your childhood mercy seem simple as breathing." Astrid moved between them, her starlight robes crackling with protective power. "Juki speaks truth, though he delights in its cruelest aspects. The tests aren't meant to destroy you, Eric. They're meant to forge you into something capable of bearing what comes next." 3 trials, Juki continued, circling them both with predatory grace. Strength, to prove your body worthy. Wisdom, to prove your mind keen. And sacrifice. The ancient thing's laugh was like bones breaking. To prove your heart true. Through the transparent walls, Eric watched Thorvald stumble, a draug's claws raking bloody furrows across his young face. The boy who'd followed him across the Whale Road, who'd sworn oaths of brotherhood over shared ale and battle fire. Eric lunged toward the wall, but his fists passed through the ghostly barrier like smoke. The first test begins now, Juki declared. Strength of arm has served you well in the living world, Ironbeard. Let's see how it fares against the champion of the dead. The chamber floor cracked and split, stone grinding against stone as something immense began to rise from the depths below. Eric caught glimpses of rusted mail, of a war helm crowned with elk antlers, of an axe that had tasted the blood of kingdoms. The figure that emerged stood 9 feet tall and broad as a ship's mast, bearing the remnants of royal finery gone to grave rot and rust. "Sigurd Bloodaxe," Astrid whispered. "King of Northumbria, dead these 30 years. He challenges every soul who seeks passage through this realm." The undead king's voice boomed like thunder off fjord walls. "Come then, raider. Show me the strength that makes lesser men call you legend." Eric looked down at his empty hands, then at his sister's expectant face. No sword, no axe, no shield. Nothing but the calloused fists that had hauled rope and split wood since boyhood, against a king who'd united the northern kingdoms through blood and iron. "The weapons of the living world have no power here," Juki observed with malicious glee. "But will, Will shapes all things in the realm of the dead." Eric closed his eyes and reached deep, past 20 years of accumulated guilt and fury, down to the bedrock truth of who he'd been before grief shaped him into something harder. He thought of Thorvald's trust, of Bjorn's weathered loyalty, of 30 men who'd followed him into darkness because they believed in the brotherhood he'd forged from their shared losses. When he opened his eyes, phantom steel gleamed in his grasp, not the sword of his living days, but something older, stronger. A blade forged from memory and need, sharp as winter wind and bright as northern stars. Sigurd Bloodaxe laughed, a sound like grinding millstones. "Better. But will you stand when I've carved the courage from your bones?" The dead king charged, his great axe singing through air thick with grave mist. Eric met him blade to blade, the impact ringing through the impossible chamber like a bell tolling the end of days. Above them, his men fought for their lives, while ancient powers watched and judged. The first test had begun, and dawn felt very far away. The clash of phantom steel against ancient iron sent shockwaves through the chamber that had nothing to do with sound. Eric's will-forged blade held but barely. Sigurd Bloodaxe possessed the strength of a king who'd carved 3 kingdoms from blood and bone, amplified now by decades of rage festering in death. The dead king's second strike nearly shattered Eric's guard. The massive axe head whistled past his ear close enough to part his beard, and he felt the cold hunger radiating from the weapon like winter fog. This wasn't just battle. It was the accumulated fury of every warrior who'd ever died believing they deserved better. "Your blade trembles, raider," Sigurd taunted, his elk-crowned helm catching the chamber's pulsing light. "Is this the strength that terrorized the Saxon shores, the will that broke monastery walls?" Eric circled left, keeping his phantom sword between himself and the king's reach. Above them, he could hear Bjorn's voice roaring commands, organizing a shield wall, buying precious seconds with tactics learned through years of desperate battles. His second in command was doing what Eric had trained him to do, lead when leadership meant survival. The thought sparked something deeper than mere determination. These weren't just his men dying above, they were his brothers, forged through shared hardship into something stronger than blood kinship. Every scar they bore, every oath they'd sworn, every moment they'd stood back to back against impossible odds had built the foundation Eric now drew upon. His blade steadied, growing brighter. Sigurd noticed immediately, his ancient eyes narrowing with something approaching respect. "Ah, You begin to understand. Strength isn't the arm that swings the sword. It's the reasons that guide the swing. The king's next assault came in a whirlwind of calculated fury. Axe blade and sword edge met in a symphony of ringing steel that echoed through dimensions Eric had no names for. But with each parry, each desperate counter-strike, Eric felt his phantom weapon grow more solid, more real. Memory gave it weight. Every shield brother who trusted him with their lives, every moment when standing firm had meant the difference between victory and slaughter. Through the transparent walls, he watched young Thorvald plant his back against Gunnar's, their weapons weaving a pattern of protection around 3 wounded warriors. The boy had learned well, not just the mechanics of blade work, but the deeper truth that strength multiplied when shared. Pride swelled in Eric's chest, pure and fierce as forge fire. His sword blazed like captured starlight. Better, Sigurd admitted, pressing his attack with renewed vigor. But knowing your reasons isn't enough. Can you hold to them when everything else falls away? The chamber around them began to shift and blur. The walls showing his men's desperate battle faded to shadow, leaving only Eric and the dead king in a space that felt carved from primordial darkness. Astrid's voice reached him from somewhere beyond sight, carrying notes of encouragement and warning in equal measure. Isolation. This was the test within the test. Could he find strength without witnesses, without the immediate press of brotherhood to sustain him? In the living world, he'd always fought surrounded by loyal spears, drawing courage from shared purpose. Here, there was only his own will against an enemy who'd never known defeat. Eric thought of Astrid as she'd been in life. Not the fevered, dying child, but the bright spirit who'd challenged him to foot races through summer meadows, who'd demanded he teach her sword forms despite their father's disapproval. She'd possessed a strength that had nothing to do with muscle, and everything to do with refusing to accept limitations others placed upon her. That same strength lived in him, had always lived in him, beneath the guilt and self-recrimination, the strength that had pulled 30 broken men into a brotherhood, the strength that had made him risk everything to follow a pale child's warning into the realm of the dead. His blade sang as it turned Sigurd's axe aside, and for the first time, Eric pressed forward. The dead king's laugh held genuine pleasure now. Yes, fight like the legend you've become, not the frightened boy you remain inside. Show me why the skalds will sing your name when kingdoms fall to dust. Steel rang against steel in patterns older than kingdoms, primal as the first warrior who'd ever stood between darkness and the hearthfire. But Eric fought now not for glory or gold, not even for the desperate need to return to his men. He fought because someone had to, because the strong owed protection to those who couldn't protect themselves, because sometimes standing firm was the only honor left in a world gone mad with hunger and need. Sigurd Bloodaxe stepped back, lowering his great axe with something approaching reverence. Enough, the dead king declared. I have seen what I needed to see. The chamber solidified around them once more, and Eric could again see his men above, still fighting, still holding the line, but pressed to their very limits. Dawn remained hours away, and already 3 warriors lay still among the scattered bones. 2 tests remained, and time was running out. Eric's phantom blade dissolved like morning mist, leaving his hands empty and trembling. The first test was passed, but victory felt hollow when measured against the carnage unfolding above. Through the transparent walls, he watched Bjorn drag wounded Leif behind an overturned table while spectral claws raked the air where the man's head had been moments before. The second test, Shuki announced, his bone-white beard crackling with eldritch energy. Wisdom, to prove your mind worthy of the choices ahead. The chamber around them shifted again, walls flowing like water to reveal not one scene but dozens, fragments of memory and possibility spinning through the air like leaves in a gale. Eric saw his childhood village burning, his father's funeral ship disappearing into morning fog, his first raid on Saxon shores. But interwoven with these familiar ghosts were visions he didn't recognize, possible futures branching out like the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Every choice creates echoes, Astrid said, her voice carrying new harmonics of sorrow. Every path walked means 10,000 others abandoned. The dead see all possibilities, what was, what is, what might yet be. One vision crystallized before Eric's eyes with terrible clarity. He saw himself 30 years hence, grey-bearded and alone, sitting in a great hall filled with treasure but empty of laughter. His men were gone, some dead in forgotten battles, others driven away by his increasingly bitter demands for perfection. The legend had consumed the man, leaving only hollow reputation and cold gold. The price of strength without wisdom, Juki observed. Many warriors achieve greatness, only to discover they've built monuments to their own isolation. Another possibility bloomed. Eric falling in the chamber above, his men's last hope dying with him. But in this vision, Astrid remained bound to her threshold duty, growing more terrible with each passing year as the balance between life and death warped around her presence. Eventually, she would become something worse than the creatures she'd once protected people from, a guardian grown mad with solitude. "The price of wisdom without courage," Astrid whispered. "Sometimes mercy becomes its own kind of cruelty." The visions multiplied, each showing the consequences of choices he'd already made and decisions yet to come. In one, he saw his men escape the cursed settlement, but carry its taint back to the living world, spreading supernatural hunger like plague across the northern kingdoms. In another, he watched himself return home, only to find his guilt transformed into something darker, a need to control every aspect of his followers' lives, to never again risk losing someone he cared about. "Enough riddles," Eric growled, though his voice shook with the weight of what he'd witnessed. "What choice must I make?" Juki's laugh was like winter wind through empty sockets. "That's the test, Raider. Not making the right choice, understanding what the choices truly cost." Above them, the battle reached a crescendo of desperation. Thorvald's young voice cracked as he called for Eric's guidance, but there was no answer save the shriek of hunting drag. Bjorn had taken a wound to his sword arm, dark blood streaming down the leather wrappings as he fought left-handed with grim determination. "They're dying," Eric said, stating the obvious, because the alternative was screaming. "They chose to follow you into darkness," Astrid replied gently, "just as you chose to lead them here, rather than let them starve on some forgotten shore. Every bond of loyalty carries the potential for mutual destruction." A new vision materialized, the cruelest yet. Eric saw the choice that awaited him at the third test, and understanding hit him like an axe blow to the chest. The sacrifice Hajuki had mentioned wasn't some abstract gesture of nobility. It was the fundamental question that had haunted him for 20 years, now given form and consequence. To save his men, to free Astrid from her eternal vigil, he would have to do what the Volva had once offered, take on the burden of guardianship himself. Become the threshold keeper, the one who tested lost souls and guided them toward whatever peace or punishment they'd earned. It would mean eternal separation from everyone he'd ever loved, watching over strangers while his memories of warmth and brotherhood faded like smoke. But it would also mean his men lived. His sister found rest, the balance between worlds maintained without requiring her endless sacrifice. "You see it now," Hajuki said with satisfaction. "The wisdom the second test demands, understanding that every meaningful choice requires losing something precious. The question becomes, what are you willing to sacrifice, and what costs are too high to bear?" Eric looked up at his dying men, then at his sister's expectant face. 20 years of guilt had prepared him for this moment without his knowing it. Every night he'd lain awake, wondering if he should have accepted the Volva's bargain had been practice for this greater test. The chamber began to shift again, preparing for the final trial. Above, Bjorn's left-handed parries grew slower, more desperate. Dawn remained hours away, but Eric's men had perhaps minutes left. He thought he understood wisdom now. It wasn't knowing the right answer, but accepting that some questions had no right answers at all. Eric stepped forward, his decision crystallizing like ice on morning water. The third test awaited, but he finally understood what Hajuki had been leading him toward. The ancient being's filed teeth gleamed with anticipation as the chamber walls dissolved into swirling mist. "I'll take the burden," Eric declared, his voice carrying across dimensions. I'll become the guardian. Free my sister, save my men. I'll pay whatever price the threshold demands. Chuki's laughter stopped abruptly. Even Astrid's luminous form went rigid with shock. No, she whispered, horror bleeding through her otherworldly composure. Eric, you don't understand what you're offering. But the words had already been spoken in a place where words held the weight of binding oaths. The chamber around them began to crack like breaking ice, reality fracturing along lines of supernatural force. Through the fissures, Eric glimpsed something vast and hungry stirring in the spaces between worlds, ancient powers that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Above them, the transparent ceiling suddenly shattered. The battle between his men and the Draug collapsed into chaos as the barrier between realms disintegrated. Spectral claws raked across living flesh, while phantom voices shrieked triumph. But worse than the immediate carnage was what poured through the broken boundaries, things that had been contained since the world was young, nightmares that fed on broken oaths and foolish sacrifice. "The balance!" Astrid cried, her form flickering like a candle in a gale. "You can't simply transfer the guardianship. It has to be earned through the trials, proven through—" Her words cut off as Huki's true nature revealed itself. The ancient figure's flesh began to slough away like rotting cloth, revealing something underneath that hurt to look upon directly. Not Juki the trial keeper, but something far older and more malevolent, a parasite that had been feeding on the threshold's power for centuries. "Perfect," the creature hissed through a mouth that opened in directions that shouldn't exist. 20 years I've waited for someone desperate enough to break the bindings with hasty words. The guardian system maintained by your precious sister was all that kept me trapped in this forgotten corner of existence. Eric reached for a weapon that wasn't there. His phantom blade failing to manifest as understanding crashed over him. His decision, the choice he'd thought would save everyone, had instead doomed them all. The trials weren't just tests of worthiness. They were safeguards, carefully constructed barriers that prevented exactly this kind of catastrophic mistake. Through the chaos above, he watched Thorvald fall beneath a Draug's claws. The boy's scream cut through the supernatural din like a blade through his heart. Bjorn roared with berserker fury, trying to reach his fallen comrade, but more creatures poured through the dimensional breach with each passing second. The third test was sacrifice. The false Huki continued, its form growing more terrible as ancient bindings snapped like overstressed rope. But not the sacrifice you imagined, Raider. The wisdom to sacrifice your need to fix everything, your crushing desire to trade yourself for others' salvation. Some burdens can't be passed along. They can only be shared or abandoned entirely. Astrid's light began to dim as her power was drawn into the expanding breach. Without the proper transition of guardianship, the threshold itself was collapsing, taking her essence with it. She looked at Eric with eyes that held no accusation, only infinite sadness. "I wanted to see you free," she said, her voice fading like wind through autumn leaves. But freedom was never about finding the perfect sacrifice. It was about learning to live with the choices we've already made. The creature that had worn Huki's face began to ascend toward the broken ceiling, reaching for the world of the living with appendages that existed in too many dimensions. Soon it would be beyond any power to contain, free to spread its hunger across the northern kingdoms like plague. Eric fell to his knees on the cracking stone, the weight of his failure crushing down upon him like a mountain. Every man who would die because of his pride, every family that would suffer because he couldn't accept that some pain couldn't be traded away, every choice that had led him from that childhood moment of helplessness to this ultimate catastrophe. Above him, Bjorn's defiant war cry cut through the chaos, the sound of a warrior who would die on his feet rather than yield to darkness. The same loyalty that had followed Eric across the Whale Road, now about to be rewarded with destruction. The chamber continued to collapse around them as ancient seals broke one by one. In minutes, perhaps less, the breach would be irreparable. The creature would be free, his men would be dead, and Astrid would fade into nothing, her centuries of sacrifice undone by his desperate need to be the hero. All seemed lost, and for the first time since childhood, Eric Ironbeard had no plan, no strength, no wisdom adequate to the darkness he'd unleashed upon the world. In the depths of his despair, a stone cracked beneath his knees, and reality hemorrhaged around him, Eric felt something shift inside his chest. Not hope. Hope was a luxury for those who still believed in solutions. This was something raw, more fundamental, a recognition that clawed its way up from the deepest chambers of his heart. He wasn't kneeling in defeat. He was kneeling at the center of everything he'd ever truly cared about. Above him, Bjorn fought with the fury of a man protecting his brothers, not for glory, not for gold, but because loyalty demanded nothing less. Thorvald, bleeding but still breathing, dragged himself toward a fallen spear with the stubborn determination Eric had helped forge in him. Even wounded Leif was trying to rise, unwilling to let his shield brothers face darkness alone. They weren't following Eric Ironbeard the legend into death. They were choosing, moment by moment, to stand together against impossible odds, because that's what warriors did. Because that's who they were, with or without him. And Astrid, his sister, wasn't fading because she was weak. She was spending her very essence to slow the catastrophe he'd unleashed, buying precious seconds not for herself, but for the living world above. Just as she had when they were children, throwing herself between him and danger without thought for the cost. The revelation struck him like lightning illuminating a storm-dark sea. He had been carrying the wrong burden for 20 years. "I couldn't save her," he whispered to the collapsing chamber, the words torn from some deep place that had never healed. "I was supposed to protect her, and I failed." The false Hajuki's terrible laughter echoed through dimensions as it ascended toward freedom. "Yes, Raider. Feel the weight of your failures. Let guilt be the final—" "But she wasn't mine to save," Eric continued, his voice growing stronger as understanding flooded through him. He raised his head, meeting Astrid's dimming gaze with eyes suddenly clear. "She was never mine to save. She was my sister, not my responsibility, not my burden to bear alone. She made her own choices, just like I made mine." The creature's laughter faltered. Eric rose to his feet, and though no phantom blade materialized in his hands, he felt stronger than he had since childhood. The guilt that had driven him across the whale road, that had made him desperate to trade his life for others, that had led him to break ancient safeguards in his need to fix everything, it was still there. But it no longer owned him. 20 years I've carried the weight of that night," he said, speaking to Astrid but somehow addressing every choice that had brought him to this moment. 20 years I've tried to earn forgiveness for surviving when you died. But you don't need me to carry that guilt, do you? You never did." Astrid's form stabilized slightly, her light growing fractionally brighter. "Eric, the Volva offered me a choice that night. Your life for mine. I said no because I was afraid, because I thought I wasn't worthy of the sacrifice. But that wasn't wisdom or cowardice." He looked around the crumbling chamber, seeing it clearly for the first time. "It was love. I couldn't bear the thought of you becoming something else, even to save your life. And you made your own choice anyway, didn't you?" Through the chaos above, he heard Gunnar's voice raised in an old sailing song, something they'd sung during the worst storms, when death seemed certain and all they had left was each other's voices against the wind. One by one, his remaining men joined the chorus, their weapons never stopping even as they sang. The false Juki had almost reached the breach between worlds, its form distending as it prepared to pour its hunger into the realm of the living. But something was wrong with its ascent. Astrid's light might be dimming, but it hadn't gone out. The threshold's collapse was slowing. "I can't undo the choices we've made," Eric said, understanding flooding through him like tide returning to a harbor. "I can't trade my life to fix everything. Can't carry everyone's burdens. Can't be the perfect leader who never loses anyone he loves. But I can choose how to face what comes next." He looked up at his men, his brothers, still fighting impossible odds, with the kind of courage that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with refusing to yield to darkness. "And I choose to fight beside them, not as their burden-bearer or their savior, but as their shield brother, because that's what we are. Not perfect, not without loss, but together. The chamber shuddered, as something fundamental shifted in the supernatural architecture around them. The false Huchuki shrieked in sudden alarm as its carefully laid trap began to unravel. Eric's refusal to be consumed by guilt, to trade himself for others' salvation, was disrupting the very foundations of the creature's power. For the first time since the nightmare began, Eric Ironbeard smiled. The real test had never been about sacrifice at all. The false Huki's shriek of alarm became a wail of fury as its ascent toward freedom suddenly reversed. The creature's impossible form, stretched between dimensions, began to collapse in on itself like a sail torn from its rigging. Where Eric's desperate sacrifice had fed its power, his newfound clarity was poison to its ancient hunger. "What are you doing?" It howled, claws that existed in 17 different realities scrabbling for purchase on the crumbling breach. "The bindings are broken. The way is open." But Astrid's light was growing stronger now, fed not by Eric's guilt, but by something far more powerful, the simple truth that love didn't require payment. Her form solidified as she stepped toward her brother, and for the first time in 20 years, she looked truly alive. "The trials were never meant to break anyone," she said, wonder coloring her voice. "They were meant to heal, to show that wisdom comes not from carrying every burden alone, but from understanding which ones are truly ours to bear." Above them, the singing grew louder. Eric could hear individual voices now, Bjorn's bass rumble carrying the melody while young Thorvald's tenor wove through it like silver thread. Even wounded, even facing impossible odds, they sang of home and brotherhood, and the kind of courage that endured beyond death itself. The sound seemed to infuse the cracking chamber with new strength. Ancient runes carved into the walls began to glow with warm light, not the cold radiance of the threshold magic, but something warmer, more human. The real power that had always protected the boundary between worlds, not duty or sacrifice, but the bonds that connected living souls. "They're magnificent," Astrid breathed, watching the battle above through eyes bright with tears that sparkled like starlight. "Your men, they're not fighting because they have to. They're choosing to stand together because that's who they are." Eric nodded, understanding flooding through him with each note of the familiar song. "They never needed me to save them. They needed me to trust them, to be the shield brother they deserved instead of the perfect leader I thought they required." The false Huki made one last desperate lunge for freedom, but its power was unraveling as quickly as it had grown. The creature had fed on guilt, on the kind of desperate sacrifice that came from believing oneself responsible for every tragedy. Eric's acceptance of shared strength rather than solitary burden was antithetical to its very nature. "This isn't possible," it snarled, as the chamber walls began to rebuild themselves around it. 20 years of careful manipulation, feeding on your guilt, waiting for the moment you'd break the safeguards in your need to fix everything myself, Eric finished. "But that's not wisdom, is it? That's just another kind of pride." The truth of it rang through the supernatural space like a bell. The trials hadn't been punishments or tests of worthiness. They'd been an elaborate healing, designed to strip away the lies that kept souls trapped in endless cycles of guilt and desperation. Understanding that some burdens were meant to be shared, accepting that love didn't require perfect protection, recognizing that true strength came from trust, not control. As the false Huki's prison reformed around it, Astrid turned to face the battle above. Her voice rang out clear and strong, adding harmonies to the warrior's song that seemed to flow directly into their weapons. Steel that had been growing dull against spectral flesh suddenly blazed with inner fire. Wounds that had been bleeding freely began to close. "The threshold doesn't need a guardian consumed by duty," she said, her form beginning to fade, not dimming this time but transforming. "It needs someone who understands that protection and freedom aren't opposites. They're the same choice, made over and over, together." Eric felt the chamber floor solidify beneath his feet as reality reasserted itself. Above, the tide of battle was turning. His men's renewed vigor, combined with weapons suddenly capable of truly harming their supernatural foes, was driving the Draug back toward whatever shadows had spawned them. But more than that, They were fighting as one mind now, each warrior anticipating his brother's movements with the kind of seamless coordination that came from absolute trust. They didn't need Eric's guidance anymore because they'd never truly needed it. They needed only what they'd always given each other: loyalty freely chosen, strength freely shared. "I have to go back to them," Eric said, though part of him wanted to remain in this place where his sister's presence felt so real, so immediate. Astrid smiled, the first truly joyful expression he'd seen from her since childhood. "I know. And Eric, thank you for not carrying my choices for me anymore. It means I can finally make new ones." The chamber began to fade around him, reality calling him back to the world of steel and blood and brotherhood. But as Eric felt himself being drawn upward toward the battle, he carried with him something he'd lost 20 years ago, not the absence of guilt, but the presence of hope. His men were waiting, and together they would face whatever came next. Eric emerged from the collapsing chamber, like a man surfacing from drowning depths, his feet finding solid stone as reality solidified around him. The great hall materialized with jarring suddenness, torchlight replacing otherworldly radiance, the clash of steel drowning out the fading echoes of supernatural screams. His men were winning. The knowledge hit him with startling clarity as he took in the scene. Where moments before the battle had seemed hopeless, his warriors now fought with renewed strength that blazed from within. Their weapons, no longer ineffective against spectral flesh, carved through the remaining Draug like fire through morning mist. But it was more than enhanced steel that drove their enemies back. It was the way they moved together, each man anticipating his shield brother's needs, with the fluid grace of a ship's crew, riding familiar swells. Bjorn's massive frame spun like a dancer, his axe clearing space for Thorvald to strike at a Draug's exposed flank. The young warrior, blood still wet on his shoulder but his eyes bright with purpose, drove his spear through spectral ribs with surgical precision. Even wounded Leif had found his feet, his shield forming an unbreakable anchor around which the others flowed like water around stone. They sang as they fought, the old sailing song lifting their voices above the supernatural din. The melody that had guided them through countless storms now served as their battle rhythm, each verse marking another coordinated strike, each chorus celebrating brotherhood that transcended flesh and bone. "Jarl!" Gunnar's voice carried across the hall, relief and fierce joy mingling in the single word. "The bastards are breaking!" It was true. The Draug, those hungering spirits that had seemed infinite in number, were dissolving back into shadow with each passing moment. Whatever power had sustained them in the mortal realm was failing, the Threshold's ancient protections reasserting themselves as the false guardian's influence collapsed. Eric drew his real sword, solid steel familiar in his grip after the phantom blades of the Trial Realm, and stepped into the fight, not as their savior or their burden-bearer, but as one warrior among equals. His blade found spectral flesh with satisfying weight, and the Draug he struck shrieked as it crumbled to ash and memory. "Together, brothers," he called, his voice joining the song that bound them. "Let's send these dead things back where they belong." The response was immediate, a roar of approval that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cursed village. His men rallied around him not because they needed his guidance, but because their circle was finally complete again. The formation they took was as natural as breathing, Bjorn's strength anchoring the center, while Thorvald's speed protected their flanks, Gunnar's tactical mind reading the flow of battle, while Leif's stubborn courage held the line unbreakable. Eric found himself laughing as he fought, actual laughter, rich with joy he'd forgotten he could feel. When was the last time battle had been this pure? Not a grim duty or desperate gamble, but a celebration of everything they were together. His sword sang through the air in harmony with his brother's weapons, each strike part of a greater symphony they composed with steel and courage. The last Draug fell as the first hint of dawn touched the hall's broken roof. Spectral claws dissolved into morning light while phantom voices faded to whispers, then silence. The unnatural cold that had permeated the village began to lift, replaced by the clean bite of northern air that spoke of home and hearth and the living world's endless renewal. In the sudden quiet, Eric's men looked around at each other with the slightly stunned expressions of warriors who had expected to die gloriously and instead found themselves victorious. Blood on their weapons was already fading, the supernatural taint leaving only honest steel behind. "Well," Bjorn rumbled, leaning heavily on his axe as exhaustion finally caught up with him. "That was different." Thorvald laughed, a sound bright with youth and survival. "Different enough for me, brother. I prefer my enemies to bleed proper red when you cut them." But as the immediate triumph faded, Eric felt a deeper understanding settling over the group. They had won more than a battle here. The trials, the revelation in the chamber below, the choice to fight together rather than follow blindly, all of it had forged something new from the bonds they'd always shared. Looking at his men's faces in the growing dawn light, Eric saw the change reflected in their eyes. They weren't his followers anymore, if they ever truly had been. They were his brothers by choice, his equals in all the ways that mattered. The weight of command that had pressed down on him for 20 years had transformed into something lighter but stronger, the freely given trust of warriors who had chosen their path together. "The village," Gunnar said quietly, gesturing toward the doorway where morning light revealed empty houses no longer shrouded in supernatural dread. "Is it safe now?" Eric nodded, certainty flowing through him like warmth returning to frozen limbs. "It's safe. The threshold holds, and the Guardian—" He paused, thinking of Astrid's transformed smile. "The Guardian is finally free to protect it properly." But even as he spoke, Eric felt a subtle tension in the air, not the oppressive dread that had marked this place, but something else, an awareness that their victory here, profound as it was, had consequences rippling outward like stones cast into still water. "We should go home," Leif said, echoing what they all felt. "This place is clean now, but it's not meant for the living." Eric agreed, but as they began gathering their gear, he couldn't shake the feeling that home itself might have changed in their absence. They had been transformed by what happened here, tested, broken down, and rebuilt stronger. But the world they returned to would test that new strength in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The final confrontation, he realized, wouldn't be with supernatural enemies or ancient curses. It would be with the life they chose to build with the truths they'd learned in darkness. As they stepped from the cursed village into the cold morning air, Eric felt the change immediately. The world beyond the threshold wasn't merely different. It was alive with possibilities that hadn't existed before they'd entered that haunted place. The fjord stretched before them like polished steel, but where they'd left their longship, the water now teemed with vessels. Dozens of them. Dragon-proud warships bearing the banners of Jarls Eric had wronged, merchants he'd raided, settlements he'd burned in his 20 years of running from his own ghosts. The sight should have filled him with familiar dread. Another fight, another desperate gamble, another chance to trade his life for his men's escape. Instead, he felt only a strange, steady calm. "Well," Gunnar said quietly, counting the odds with a tactician's eye, "word of our little adventure has traveled faster than we expected." Bjorn hefted his axe with weary resignation. "How many do you count, brother? I see at least 8 ships, maybe more behind those rocks." "Closer to 12, Thorvald said, his young eyes sharper in the distance. "And they're not flying raiding flags. Those are war banners." Eric studied the assembled fleet with the same clarity he'd brought to the trials below. Each ship represented choices he'd made in his years of guilt-driven raiding, families destroyed, treasures stolen, peace shattered by a man trying to outrun his own failures. He could see specific vessels now, the Wave Strider belonging to Jarl Halfdan, whose daughter Eric's crew had accidentally killed during a raid gone wrong. The merchant vessel Silver Gull that he'd stripped of winter supplies, leaving its crew to starve. Others he recognized from a dozen different ports, all bearing grievances as legitimate as they were dangerous. Any other time, he would have been calculating escape routes, weighing his men's lives against impossible odds, searching for some way to sacrifice himself so they could slip away free. The familiar weight of responsibility would have crushed down on him, demanding he fix everything, save everyone, carry every burden alone. But the trials had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. These weren't his sins to bear in isolation. They were consequences that belonged to all of them, choices made by the brotherhood they'd forged together across years of raiding and survival. More importantly, facing those consequences didn't require the same desperate patterns that had driven him for 20 years. "They've been waiting," Leif observed, reading the ship's positions with a sailor's intuition. "This isn't a chance encounter. Someone organized this." Eric nodded, understanding crystallizing like ice forming on still water. "They want to end this, all of it. 20 years of Eric Ironbeard's crew cutting their own path through the whale road, taking what they needed, answering to no one." He looked at his men, his brothers, with new eyes. "The question is, what do we want?" It was Gunnar who spoke first, his weathered face thoughtful in the morning light. "I'm tired of running, Jarl. Tired of making enemies faster than we can sail away from them. Whatever we built out there." He gestured toward the fjord, but Eric knew he meant their years of raiding, their reputation, their legacy of taking what they needed regardless of the cost. It was never going to last forever. Thorvald surprised them all by speaking next. "My father died in a raid much like the ones we've led. Raiders came, took what they wanted, left nothing but ash and grief. I told myself our raids were different because we had reasons, because we were running from something, instead of just taking for greed." "But the dead don't care about our reasons, do they?" Bjorn's laughter rumbled like distant thunder, but it carried no mockery. "Listen to the boy, speaking wisdom like a grey beard. But he's right. We've spent 20 years telling ourselves we were different from other raiders because we were driven by something deeper than gold hunger. But we still left the same kind of wreckage behind us." Eric felt the weight of their words, but it wasn't the crushing burden of guilt he'd carried for so long. This was different, cleaner, somehow. They were acknowledging truth without drowning in it, accepting responsibility without being consumed by it. The difference was subtle but profound. They were choosing to face this together. "So we stand and fight?" Leif asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No," Eric said, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. "We go talk to them." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Eric could see his men processing this, weighing it against everything they'd learned in the cursed village. They had spent decades believing that their only choices were running or dying gloriously. But the trials had revealed a third option, the hardest one of all. They could choose to change. "All of us," Eric continued, looking each man in the eye. "Together. Whatever comes next, we face it as brothers. No more running, no more desperate gambits, no more trying to fix 20 years of choices with one grand gesture." The final test wasn't supernatural at all. It was simply this, having the courage to face the life they'd built, and choose to build something better. Eric drew his sword, not in preparation for battle, but to lay it across his palms in the ancient gesture of parley. The morning sun caught the blade's edge, sending flashes of light across the water toward the waiting fleet, like signals in a language older than words. "If we're doing this," he said quietly, "we do it right. No weapons drawn in anger, no last-moment heroics. We face what we've built together, and we accept whatever judgment comes." The walk down to their longship felt like descending into the halls of the gods themselves. Each step carried the weight of 20 years' worth of choices, but Eric no longer felt crushed by that burden. His men moved with him in formation, not the desperate solidarity of cornered animals, but the purposeful stride of warriors who had chosen their path with clear eyes. Their ship sat alone in the center of the fjord like a single wolf surrounded by a pack. As they rowed toward the assembled fleet, Eric could see faces lining the gunwales of the war vessels, hard men and women whose lives his crew had touched with fire and steel. Some he recognized, Jarl Halfdan's granite features twisted with years of grief, the merchant Captain Eriksson whose crew had starved because of Eric's raid, others whose names he'd never learned but whose hatred burned as bright as forge fire. The Wave Strider moved forward as the flagship, and Jarl Halfdan's voice carried across the water, like the judgment of winter itself. "Eric Ironbeard, 20 years you've cut your bloody path across the whale road. 20 years you've taken from honest folk, left ash where there was prosperity, graves where there were families. Eric stood in his ship's prow, feeling his men's presence like an anchor behind him, not the weight that drags a vessel down, but the solid foundation that keeps it stable in rough seas. I know what we've done, Halfdan. We all do. The question is, what happens now? Now? Halfdan's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Now you face the accounting. Every family you've torn apart, every village you've burned, every life you've stolen for your own purposes. We've come to collect the debt you owe. In the old days, even as recently as this morning, Eric would have been calculating odds, looking for angles, trying to find some way to shoulder all the blame himself so his men might escape with their lives. But the trials had burned away that particular madness, leaving something cleaner in its place. The debt is real, he said, his voice carrying across the water to every ship. We took what we needed without counting the cost to others. We told ourselves our reasons made it different, made it justified. We were wrong. The admission sent ripples of surprise through the assembled fleet. This wasn't the defiant last stand they'd expected, the heroic death song of cornered raiders. Eric could see confusion replacing some of the burning hatred in their eyes. Gunnar stepped forward beside him, adding his voice to Eric's. We were wrong, and we knew it even as we did it. Fear doesn't excuse what we became. Loss doesn't justify what we took from you. One by one, his brothers joined them at the ship's rail. Bjorn, with his massive presence, Thorvald straight-backed despite his youth, Leif steady as stone, each man facing the assembled fleet not with resignation or defiance, but with the kind of honest courage that could only come from accepting truth completely. You seek justice, Eric continued, seeing how his men's solidarity changed the dynamic before them. Several of the war captains were exchanging uncertain glances. This wasn't the confrontation they'd prepared for. We offer no excuses, ask for no mercy we haven't earned. But we do offer something else. What could you possibly offer that would balance 20 years of blood? Halfdan's voice carried the weight of every father who had lost a child to raiders' greed. Eric felt the answer rising from the same deep place that had guided him through the supernatural trials. Not wisdom imposed from outside, but truth discovered in the crucible of shared burden and freely chosen trust. Our lives, he said simply, not thrown away in glorious battle, not spent in one grand gesture of meaningless sacrifice. Our lives dedicated to building instead of taking, to protecting instead of raiding, to serving something larger than our own fear and guilt. The silence that followed was profound as winter snow. Eric could feel the weight of dozens of minds processing this unexpected turn, warriors and merchants and grieving families trying to understand what justice looked like when the guilty chose to face it willingly. When Halfdan spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, still hard, still demanding, but touched with something that might have been the beginning of possibility. Words are easy, Ironbeard. What surety do we have that this isn't just another raider's trick? Eric smiled, feeling his sister's presence like warm sunlight on his face. The answer was as clear as the morning light dancing across the fjord's surface. None, he said. Except this, we're choosing to stop running. The words hung in the salt air between them, carrying more weight than any sword blow. Eric watched understanding dawn on Halfdan's weathered features. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but the recognition that this moment balanced on a knife's edge between justice and vengeance. Stop running, Halfdan repeated slowly. Pretty words from a man whose feet have never stopped moving for 20 years. His eyes swept across Eric's crew, taking their measure with a warrior's instinct. But running is what you know, Ironbeard. It's what you are. What makes you think you can simply choose to be something else? Eric felt the question pierce him like a blade, finding the gap between male links. In the supernatural realm below, facing his sister's truth had seemed to transform everything. But here, under the open sky with his victim's eyes upon him, the magnitude of what he was offering struck him with fresh force. To stop running meant giving up the only identity he'd known since Astrid's death. For 20 years, Eric the Raider had been his refuge from Eric the failed brother, the man who couldn't save the one person who mattered most. Every raid, every desperate escape, every impossible gamble had been a way of outrunning that fundamental failure. The guilt was familiar, comfortable in its way, a burden that justified everything and explained nothing. But redemption, actually building something instead of taking it, that required becoming someone he'd never been, someone he wasn't sure he knew how to be. "He's right," Eric said quietly, the admission tasting like ashes in his mouth. He could feel his men's surprised attention, the shift in their formation as his words registered. "Running is what I know, taking what I need, surviving by my wits, staying one step ahead of consequences. That's been my life since I was 25 years old." Murmurs rippled through the assembled fleet. Some carried satisfaction. They'd known this confession would come. Others held confusion, unsure why the legendary Ironbeard was dismantling his own position. "To stop running," Eric continued, his voice growing stronger, "means giving up the only version of myself I've trusted for 2 decades. It means accepting that the man I became after my sister died, the clever raider, the survivor, the one who could always find an angle or a way out, that man has to die." The silence that followed was profound. Eric could see Halfdan's eyes narrowing, trying to understand where this was leading. Behind him, he felt rather than saw his men's reaction, Gunnar's sharp intake of breath, Bjorn's low rumble of concern, Thorvald's youth struggling to process the implications. "That's the real sacrifice, isn't it?" Eric said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Not our lives in battle, not our freedom in chains. The sacrifice is everything we've been, everything we've told ourselves we are. The sacrifice is admitting that the skills we've honed, the reputation we've built, the brotherhood we've forged, all of it was constructed around running from truth." He turned slightly, meeting each of his men's eyes in turn. "I'm asking you to give up being Eric Ironbeard's crew. I'm asking you to trust that what we build instead will be worth more than what we were." Gunnar was the first to speak, his tactical mind cutting straight to the heart of it. 20 years of learning to think like raiders, to solve problems with steel and cunning and quick escapes. "You're asking us to forget all of that?" "Not forget," Eric said. "Transform it. Use what we know about survival to help others survive. Use our understanding of violence to protect instead of plunder. Use the bonds we've forged in darkness to build something that can stand in the light." Thorvald's young voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "What if we can't? What if we try to change and just break instead?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eric could see the same fear reflected in every face on every ship. Not just his men, but their victims too. Everyone here had built their identity around this conflict in some way. Eric, the unstoppable raider, Halfdan, the implacable pursuer, the eternal dance of hunter and hunted that had given their lives meaning for 20 years. "Then we break," Eric said simply. "And from the pieces, we build something new. Not because it's safe, not because it's easy, but because it's the only choice that leads anywhere but more of the same." He stepped forward to the very edge of his ship's prow, close enough to the water that one push would send him into the fjord's dark embrace. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the water with absolute clarity. "I offer you Eric Ironbeard's life, Halfdan. Not his death, his life. The reputation, the legend, the man who could always escape justice through cleverness and luck. That man dies here, in these waters, witnessed by all of you. What grows from that death, that's for us to discover together." The morning sun climbed higher, and Eric felt the weight of transformation settling on his shoulders like a cloak woven from possibility and terror in equal measure. The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn taut, every soul across the assembled fleet holding their breath as Eric's words settled into the morning air. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the water that seemed to shift and dance with the weight of transformation itself. Halfdan's weathered face worked through emotions like storm clouds racing across a mountain peak, grief, rage, confusion, and something that might have been the first stirring of possibility. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful weight of a man testing each word before releasing it. "You speak of death and rebirth as if they were choices a man could make standing on his ship's deck," Halfdan said slowly. "But I've seen too many raiders claim redemption with their last breath, thinking pretty words could wash away 20 years of blood." Eric nodded, understanding the skepticism completely. "Words alone mean nothing, I know that. We all know that." He gestured toward his men, who stood with him in perfect solidarity despite their obvious uncertainty. "That's why we're not just offering words." Thorvald stepped forward, his young voice carrying across the water with surprising strength. "I was 7 when raiders killed my father. Spent 13 years dreaming of revenge, of making them pay for what they took from me. But standing here now—" He paused, gathering courage that seemed too large for his slight frame. "Killing Eric won't bring my father back, but maybe what Eric becomes could prevent other children from losing theirs." A ripple of movement passed through the assembled fleet as men and women processed this unexpected perspective. Eric could see the shift, not acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the wall of absolute judgment that had surrounded them. Gunnar's tactical mind seized the moment. "The merchant vessel Golden Gull that we raided 3 years past. Your crew survived, Captain Eriksson." "But barely." He addressed one of the ship captains directly. "We took your winter supplies, left you to starve. What if we spent the rest of our lives ensuring that never happens to another merchant crew?" "And my daughter?" Halfdan's voice cracked like breaking ice. "What of Ingrid, who died when your raid went wrong? What could you possibly do that would balance that scale?" The question hit Eric like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch from it. "Nothing," he said simply. "Nothing we do will bring her back or heal that wound. But perhaps we could ensure that other daughters live, other families stay whole, use what we know about raiding to help settlements defend themselves, use our understanding of the whale road to protect traders instead of preying on them." Bjorn's rumbling voice added weight to the offer. "We know how raiders think because we are raiders. We know their weaknesses, their strategies, their patterns. That knowledge could serve a different purpose." Eric watched Halfdan's face carefully, seeing the war between 20 years of hatred and the unexpected possibility of something larger than vengeance. Around them, the assembled fleet waited in tense silence, warriors and merchants and grieving families all balanced on the knife's edge of this moment. "Prove it," Halfdan said finally. "Here, now. Show me that Eric Ironbeard can truly die." Without hesitation, Eric drew his sword, the blade that had carved his reputation across 2 decades of raiding. He held it high, feeling the weight of every life it had taken, every village it had terrorized, every desperate escape it had carved through overwhelming odds. The morning sun caught the steel, sending brilliant flashes across the water. "This sword has been my answer to every problem for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying to every ship. "When I was afraid, I drew it. When I was guilty, I used it to take what I needed to forget. When I was cornered, I trusted it to cut my way free." He reversed his grip, offering the hilt toward Halfdan's ship. "I offer it to you now, not as surrender, but as transformation. Let Eric Ironbeard's blade serve justice instead of guilt." The gesture sent shockwaves through both fleets. Leif stepped forward, drawing his own weapon, and mine. Gunnar followed, then Bjorn, then young Thorvald with his father's axe. One by one, Eric's entire crew offered their blades, not in defeat, but in a choice that transcended anything they'd imagined possible when the morning began. Halfdan stared at the offered weapons, his face a study in conflicting emotions. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality entirely. 20 years I've pursued you, Ironbeard. 20 years I've dreamed of watching you die. But this—" He gestured toward the unprecedented scene before him. "This is not the ending I expected." Eric felt something profound shifting in the space between their ships, like ice breaking up after a hard winter. "Endings are just beginnings wearing different clothes, Halfdan. The question is, what do we choose to begin?" The morning light danced across the fjord's surface. illuminating possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine when the sun first rose. The silence stretched until it became something almost sacred, a pause between one world and another. Eric watched Halfdan's weathered face work through decades of hatred and fresh possibility, the conflict written in every line carved by 20 years of pursuit. When Halfdan finally moved, it was with the careful deliberation of a man crossing ice he wasn't sure would hold. He reached across the gap between their ships, not for Eric's offered sword, but extending his own weathered hand. "I accept your weapons," he said, his voice rough with emotions too complex for simple words. "Not as trophies, but as tools for building something neither of us can yet imagine." The moment their hands clasped, Eric felt the last chains of his old identity snap. Not the dramatic breaking he'd expected, but something quieter, like the soft sound of snow settling after an avalanche. Eric Ironbeard, the legend who had terrorized the northern seas, died in that handclasp. What remained was simply a man named Eric, uncertain and afraid, but finally, truly free. "What happens now?" Gunnar asked, his tactical mind already working to understand this new landscape they'd entered. "Now we go home," Halfdan said, though his eyes never left Eric's face. "All of us, but not as we were." The return journey took 3 days, a strange flotilla of former enemies learning to navigate waters that had completely changed meaning. Eric's crew distributed themselves among the other ships at Halfdan's suggestion, not as prisoners, but as the first tentative step towards something larger than either fleet had been alone. Eric found himself aboard Halfdan's flagship, working alongside men who had dreamed of his death for years. The work was awkward, tense, filled with moments when old reflexes nearly shattered the fragile peace they were building. But gradually, something shifted. Shared tasks led to shared stories, and shared stories began to weave new connections where old hatred had been. On the second evening, as they sheltered in a familiar cove, Captain Eriksson approached Eric with careful steps. "The merchant vessel you raided 3 years past," he said quietly. "We lost good men to the starvation that followed." Eric met his eyes without flinching. "I know. I remember your ship, your crew. We told ourselves we needed those supplies more than you did. Did you?" The question was genuine, not accusatory. "No," Eric admitted. "We were afraid of being hungry, so we made you starve instead. Fear made us selfish, and we called it necessity." Eriksson nodded slowly, processing this honesty. "My son asks about raiders sometimes, about why they do what they do. I never knew what to tell him." He paused, watching the evening light dance on the water. "Maybe now I have a different answer." By the third day, as familiar coastlines appeared through the morning mist, Eric barely recognized the man who had left these waters as a desperate raider. The change wasn't dramatic, no transformation of flesh or soul, just the quiet settling of a mind no longer at war with itself. They made landfall at Halfdan's settlement first, a thriving village that had grown strong partly in defiance of the raiding that had plagued these waters. As they approached the dock, Eric could see crowds gathering, families who had lived with the threat of his name for 20 years, now watching their protector return with the enemy himself. The reception was tense, suspicious, filled with hard stares and whispered conversations. But Halfdan's word carried weight here, and gradually the crowd's hostility shifted toward wary curiosity. When Eric stepped onto the dock, not as a conqueror but as a man seeking to build rather than take, something fundamental changed in the fabric of this place. That evening, in Halfdan's great hall, the real work began. Maps were spread across long tables, trade routes traced with careful fingers, defensive strategies discussed with the expertise of men who knew both sides of the equation. Eric found his raider's knowledge transformed into something useful. Understanding wind patterns helped plan merchant voyages, knowing hidden coves aided in establishing watchposts, recognizing the signs of other raiders served to protect rather than prey. "It's strange," Thorvald said during a quiet moment, his young face thoughtful in the firelight. I expected redemption to feel different. Grander, somehow. How does it feel? Eric asked. Like work, Thorvald admitted. Hard work, every day. Choosing to build instead of take, to think of others before ourselves. It's not glorious at all. Eric smiled, feeling his sister's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder. Not the desperate ghost of his guilt, but the loving memory of who she had been. The best transformations rarely are. Outside, the northern lights began their dance across the star-filled sky, painting the world in colors that spoke of magic and possibility. Eric watched them through the hall's windows, no longer a man running from his past, but one finally, truly ready to build his future. The return was complete, but the journey, the real journey, was just beginning, the new beginning. 3 months later, Eric stood on the headland overlooking the expanded harbor, watching merchant vessels navigate waters that had once known only fear. The morning air carried the sounds of honest work, hammers shaping hulls, voices calling across the docks, children laughing near the fish-cleaning stations without glancing nervously toward the horizon. The settlement had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun as Halfdan's village had transformed into something unprecedented, a place where former raiders worked alongside former victims, where the deep knowledge of the whale roads served protection instead of predation. Ships arrived weekly now, drawn by word that these waters were truly safe, that the legendary Ironbeard himself stood watch against the very dangers he had once embodied. The grain shipment from the southern settlements arrived this morning, Gunnar reported, approaching with a ledger that would have seemed impossible in their raiding days. The grizzled warrior had discovered an unexpected talent for logistics, his tactical mind perfectly suited to coordinating the complex web of trade relationships they were building. Captain Eriksson says his son wants to apprentice with our harbor watch when he's old enough. Eric smiled at that. Eriksson's boy, the child who had once asked why raiders did what they did, now dreamed of protecting other children from that same fate. The symmetry felt like grace. And the scout reports from the northern channels? Eric asked. Bjorn spotted raiders moving south 3 days out. Small crew, desperate from the look of them. Gunnar's expression grew thoughtful. He's following at distance, waiting for your word. This was the test they faced regularly now, former wolves learning to shepherd rather than hunt. Eric had developed protocols, ways of intercepting raiding parties that offered choices rather than simple violence. Some took the offered path toward redemption. Others had to be stopped the harder way. All of them faced the same decision Eric had confronted in those fjord waters: transform or remain trapped in cycles of violence that led nowhere but to more violence. Send word to prepare the swift current for departure, Eric decided, and ask Thorvald to gather the intervention crew. If these raiders are desperate enough to risk these protected waters, they need to hear what we've learned about building instead of taking. Gunnar nodded and headed back toward the harbor, his step carrying the confidence of a man who understood his purpose. Eric watched him go, marveling at how completely their roles had transformed. Where once they had planned raids to take what others had built, they now strategized ways to protect and create. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Halfdan climbed the headland path with the measured pace of a man whose long hunt had found its true quarry at last. His former nemesis had aged visibly in these months, but the lines in his face spoke of satisfaction rather than weariness. The families from the burned settlements have agreed to relocate here, Halfdan reported, settling beside Eric on the stone outcropping where they often met to discuss the day's business. 17 households, including 3 with children under 10. They'll need housing before winter. The shipwright's quarter has space, Eric replied, and we'll need their skills anyway. Word is spreading about our success here. More ships mean more need for maintenance and repair. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 men who had spent 20 years as enemies now planning a future neither could have imagined. The morning sun painted the harbor in shades of gold and possibility, illuminating a world where former raiders taught young people to read the weather, where merchants' children played alongside the sons and daughters of warriors, where the skills of survival were turned toward helping others thrive. "Do you miss it?" Halfdan asked quietly. "The freedom of the whale road, the excitement of the unknown, the simplicity of taking what you needed and sailing away?" Eric considered the question carefully. In truth, there were moments when the weight of responsibility felt crushing, when the complexity of building something lasting seemed impossibly difficult compared to the clean simplicity of raiding. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by something deeper and more nourishing than anything his old life had offered. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't miss the running. I don't miss looking over my shoulder or wondering if today would be the day our luck ran out." He gestured toward the harbor, where Thorvald was organizing the intervention crew with the easy authority of a young man who had found his calling. "This is harder work, but it's work that builds something larger than ourselves." Halfdan nodded slowly. "My daughter would have been 27 this season. Old enough to have children of her own, probably. Sometimes I watch the young families here and wonder what kind of grandmother she would have made my wife." The pain in his voice was real, but no longer consuming. Grief remained, but it had transformed from a weapon into something that informed their purpose without defining it. "She's part of this," Eric said softly. "Every child who grows up safe in these waters, every family that doesn't have to fear the horizon, that's her legacy too." Below them, the swift current was making ready to sail. Soon Eric would take his transformed crew to meet desperate raiders in waters where compassion and strength could offer choices that violence alone never could. It was dangerous work, uncertain work, but it was work that led somewhere other than endless cycles of taking and running. The northern lights would dance again tonight, painting the sky in colors that spoke of magic and possibility. But Eric no longer needed their beauty to believe in transformation. He lived it every day, in the harbor growing strong below, in the faces of children who played without fear, in the quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlast any legend. The man who had once been Eric Ironbeard, terror of the northern seas, walked back toward the harbor where honest work waited. Behind him, the headland stood empty, save for the morning wind and the endless possibility of what determined people could build when they chose creation over destruction.